All right. Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Geoffrey Cain, an investigative journalist and technology writer, join us to discuss China's Turks and the perfect police state. Mr. Cain will speak for 15 minutes that open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Geoffrey Cain.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stacey, for having me, and it's good to be here today. Just to introduce myself a little more, so I am a technology writer. I was formerly with The Economist for many years. I was a foreign correspondent in China, Turkey, and Russia and South Korea, where my specialty was writing about how authoritarian regimes use new forms of technology. So being based in China for all these years, I had spent many years visiting within China, the region of Xinjiang, which is a region of Western China that maybe many of you are familiar with, is where about 1/10 of the Muslim minority population, the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and a few other ethnic groups, are being held in a network of about 300 concentration camps. And these estimates are always fluctuating, but most recently, as of about a year ago, the number reached its high at the estimate was around 1.8 million people. Many of them are now being transferred to labor camps where they engage in labor and other forms of repression. But the system as it existed still is fundamentally there today. So I had written my second book, The Perfect Police State, about the region of Xinjiang. I had spent many years, 3 years in Turkey, in Ankara and Istanbul, and a few other small towns, interviewing the Uyghur diaspora of the country. Turkey is the country that, as a fellow Turkic group, allows the greatest number of refugees of Uyghurs into the country. And so I spent many years interviewing them, gathering their stories. I couldn't do a lot of this research in China for understandable reasons. And the result of this research was my book, The Perfect Police State, an undercover odyssey into China's terrifying surveillance dystopia of the future. So I'm here at the Middle East Forum today because this is a topic that very much resonates with watchers and analysts of the Middle East. This is a topic that has perhaps more than any other major social or political force in the world really has shaped China's relations with the Middle East and with its own Muslim minority. There are many of these historical parallels that we can draw. So, the Dutch were in Aceh in Indonesia. There was an issue there with the Muslim minority. There's the Philippines in the south in Mindanao. There is a history of Islamic insurgency involving hardliners across the East Asian and Southeast Asian space. But what makes this particular case unique and alarming, at least to me, is the novel uses of technology to profile, document, and surveil the Muslim minority. So there are new systems of artificial intelligence that have been rolled out in this region. The Chinese government calls its surveillance system Skynet, as in Terminator. In the Chinese language, it does have a different context, but there is this massive AI dragnet that is documenting the actions of pretty much every single resident of this region. So basic, involvement in basic Islamic practices. So growing a beard, going to a mosque, being caught reading a Quran, or being caught with a Quran app on your smartphone. These are all actions that are liable in Western China to get you sent to one of these concentration camps, even if you haven't been, convicted of a crime. What the Chinese government does is it uses a predictive policing system. So the AI system will try to predict, based on these actions, whether you are at risk of becoming a terrorist in the future or a criminal of some kind. And so they'll send you to one of these concentration camps to brainwash you, to psychologically, physically torture you, to turn you into a good patriot, and to really, do all these horrible things that that are designed to erase Uyghur cultural and religious identity. So this particular topic, witnessing this firsthand um, is something that it really did shock me. It is a very new phenomenon, I think, and it did shock me in many ways because the project that the Chinese state is undertaking, um, does seem to be succeeding so far in, in creating a kind of cultural and social genocide of the Uyghur and the Kazakh minorities in the country. Um, this is the largest internment of a minority since World War II. And the thing that is, different from other historical cases of Muslim insurgencies is just the extent of the repression and the success with which the Chinese state is carrying these policies out. Um, I've documented many psychological effects against the Muslim minority of China. So many people who've left, who've escaped as refugees, recount their identity undergoing this process of erasure and removal using this high-tech surveillance. The Chinese state has succeeded in creating a system in which everybody feels they are being watched, but they're not always sure when or where. There's this AI system watching them through cameras and communicating with the police, about their whereabouts and say, whether they entered the door at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. that day. Is that suspicious? Is that something abnormal? This is something that, I think me and other researchers have documented now in vast numbers, just the extent to which China has succeeded in ensuring that this particular group is culturally wiped out, that they're assimilated to the majority Han Chinese ethnic group. Um, Now that said, I use the term cultural genocide, and that's something that is always up for discussion and debate because what is a cultural genocide? That term by itself, has its own specific debate and meaning behind it. But the United States and a handful of other governments, particularly in the West, have accused China of committing genocide in this situation in Xinjiang. And in particular, they point to the United Nations Genocide Convention, which states that the use of forced sterilization, which is now happening in Xinjiang, is one element of genocide, as well as the erasure, the attempted erasure of a cultural group through, language training, getting them to speak the majority language, erasing their history, erasing monuments. These are all pillars of what a genocide is under international law. And a number of nations have taken the liberty now of documenting these atrocities and accusing China formally of genocide. So one of the, I know this is an audience that's especially interested in the Middle East, and one of the things I do want to talk about briefly is the impact on relations between China as a Middle Eastern patron. China is one of the biggest patrons of nations such as Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. China has made enormous inroads with its Belt and Road Initiative, which has been going on now for about 9 years. It was started formally in 2013. It's an estimated $1 trillion mega package of infrastructure projects and aid and investment to various governments going through what was once the historical Silk Road of Central Asia. So the Belt and Road is it's a historical resurrection of this idea of Chinese greatness, along the Central Asian corridors. But it's also a modern investment project that China uses to gain leverage over, various authoritarian and quasi-authoritarian states in the Middle East and Central Asia and other parts of the world. One of the biggest surprises that many onlookers have had in this situation is that they assumed originally, about 5 years ago when these atrocities were first coming to light, that many Middle Eastern states would condemn China's treatment of the Uyghurs, perhaps would call it genocide as well, joining the US and other nations. But quite the opposite has happened actually. As a result of these massive Chinese investments, um, many Middle Eastern countries, Muslim countries, so Egypt in particular, Iran, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, they have responded by either promoting Chinese propaganda around the issue of the Uyghurs, so going along with the official line that this is a vast counterterrorism operation, or they have remained silent on the atrocities against the Uyghurs. They have, often remained silent or issued, letters through the United Nations Human Rights Council, ironically, saying that China is just doing all it can to contain the Muslim threat in its country. That that these things that are happening are just simply justified. Or Middle Eastern states have taken the more extreme route, and they've actually detained illegally Uyghur Muslims who are Chinese citizens in their countries and deported them en masse back to China, where they've been held in concentration camps and tortured. Egypt was the first offender in this case. Egypt was home to one of the biggest Uyghur populations outside of China. I believe it was number 3 or 4 behind the US and Turkey. Um, and many of these were either small business owners who had migrated, or they were students who had gone to Egypt, to study at Egyptian universities. Sometimes they were studying religion and the Quran and so forth. And in 2016 and 2017, Egypt was the recipient of major Chinese aid packages in the form of security infrastructure, things like satellite development and so forth. But written within the negotiation that they had, if you read it between the lines, it says that Egypt will help China with, security issues, that it'll help in China's national security. And the result, the interpretation of that deal was that Egypt would round up Uyghurs across the country. One recent estimate is that about 90% of the Uyghur population there, about 8,000 people, have been rounded up and sent back to China despite having legal residence permits to live in the country. Egypt has remained silent on this issue, along with just about every other Arab Muslim regime in particular. The one government that remains, I would say, steadfast and firm in not giving in to Chinese demands has been Turkey, and a handful of the Turkic Muslim states, because the Uyghurs are also a fellow Turkic ethnic group. The Erdogan government of Turkey does not want to be seen as handing over, a group to an authoritarian regime like China, when a lot of its legitimacy really rests on welcoming refugees and having refugees from other countries in Turkey. This is something, and if any of you have read the book, when I originally wrote it, I was unsure whether the Turkic regimes were going to hold that promise and were going to keep the Uyghur population in Turkey and in Azerbaijan and these Turkic governments. But I was proven wrong in that case, and it's been almost a year since I published the book. It was published in June of last year, and it is now 1 year later, and so far Erdogan, despite his flaws and criticisms, I do have to give him credit for upholding his side of things on this Uyghur situation. And there are many geopolitical and economic reasons for Turkey in particular standing up against China. So Turkey is a competitor, an economic competitor in the construction industry, which is an enormous industry in both Turkey and China. Turkey is it's perhaps the geopolitical terminus of the Eurasian region that leads into Europe, and Turkey does not want to simply give up its strategic position to Chinese money, Chinese investments. It wants to hold firm and maintain its own influence around the region. Its own, I guess, neo-Ottoman influence is the term that many would use. And so as a result, Turkey is still the land of Uyghur refugees. The last estimate I saw is that there were about 50,000 Uyghurs living in Istanbul alone, and this is mainly in some of the outer neighborhoods. I spent a lot of time there interviewing them, and it's good to see. So anyway, this is just we're at 15 minutes now, and this is just to sum up the work that I've done, some of the work and the impact on Middle Eastern Chinese relations when it comes to the Uyghur situation. And I will open the floor to questions for anyone who has them.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have is from David. Other than accepting refugees, what is the Turkish government doing and saying about the persecution of its fellow Turks in China?
Turkey is the only Middle Eastern Muslim government, to my knowledge so far, that has publicly spoken out against China on this issue. This began in about 2019. The United Nations Human Rights Council, ironically, of all bodies that should be talking about this. So the members, some of the South American, African, and Middle Eastern members of that body issued a joint letter that defended China's actions against the Uyghurs. But around that same time, the Turkish foreign minister and various other government officials since then have actively said publicly that the way China treats the Uyghurs is unacceptable, that it's a major human rights violation, and that something needs to be done about it. Turkey has been pretty active on this topic. I don't think, looking in the big picture of, Turkey's strategic needs and directions, I don't think the Uyghur situation really fits in, to a major priority. It's the kind of thing, it's the kind of situation where, tactically, if Erdogan were to order the Uyghurs to be sent back to China, it would do political damage to him, but he doesn't really the situation remains neutral as long as they remain in Turkey. There's more damage that can be done by sending them back. So a lot of the Uyghurs who I know in Turkey, and I know hundreds of them now. It's been my base for a long time. They originally feared that Turkey was going to send them back, and they were en route to getting visas to Europe. They're trying to move to Sweden and Germany and these European countries that open their doors to refugees. But upon seeing that Turkey was proving relatively safe for them, they've mostly settled down and they feel comfortable in Turkey. I think one of the few refugee groups that is actually staying there and not moving on to Europe, interestingly.
That is interesting. An anonymous attendee does follow up on that, asking, is there any fear of Turkey sending them as fighters to Syria?
So officially, the Turkish government has denied any involvement in that. But being in the field, I have found some limited evidence that perhaps 6 to 7 years ago, Turkey was perhaps tacitly sending some fighters to Syria, perhaps, and I can't be super conclusive about this because it's still, I've done research on this. It's still a very murky topic, and it's not totally clear who has sent them. It seems more likely that the Turkish government has, turned a blind eye and has allowed Uyghur fighters to go to Syria on their own without, punishing them, without holding them to some kind of Turkish law. The major group, the Uyghur group that has been fighting in Syria in relatively small numbers, was the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Party, and another one called the TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Party. So these groups, they rose to prominence in the media after the 9/11 attacks, but their presence was always quite limited. They had some operations in Afghanistan. They later had people operating in Syria, but a lot of this has not been published because it's not something that I think the media at large has been focused on as much. But I have had my own contacts among them in Syria, and I've occasionally checked in to see how things are going. And what they report is that it's heavy losses. A lot of them have, gone back to Turkey. They've abandoned the fight. It's not really the idea originally was that they were going to get trained in Syria and Afghanistan, and with that training, they could go back and wage a jihad in Western China, try to create a breakaway state called East Turkestan. And that would be the Uyghur nation, the independence movement. it never really happened. The Chinese state, to be totally forthright, is absolutely all powerful, all seeing. It's the world's largest authoritarian regime. It's mastered a mixture of these technologies and also police and military tactics against Uyghurs who are suspects. Um, and there's just simply no way at all that any ISIS connected fighter in Syria is going to stand a chance. Also, ever since the U.S. left Afghanistan, the geopolitics of the region have shifted. The Taliban are now allies with China. Many former terrorist groups, so various ISIS figures and other figures, have publicly said that they do not want to wage a war on China, that the focus must remain on the West. China is a potential benefactor, potential ally. It doesn't really care as much about human rights and these things. And ironically, despite oppressing a Muslim group in the country, China does a lot to support the Taliban and support fundamentalist Islamic groups around the world.
Thank you. Jara Pride asks, is this technology used throughout China or only in Xinjiang?
Xinjiang was the testing ground, and ever since I began writing the book, it has slowly been rolled out across China against the general population. So it began in Xinjiang in late 2016. So the region of Xinjiang was already, under lockdown. It was already an oppressed place, but this was where the government began experimenting with these new technologies like facial recognition, AI surveillance, and so forth. From Xinjiang, it began spreading to other minority regions. So Tibet is another big example. Tibet is one that I think the global community tends to forget about these days, but it is just as repressed, if not more, than Xinjiang still, and it's a Buddhist state. Also, Inner Mongolia. So Inner Mongolia is a region that borders Mongolia. It has a Mongol minority. It's resource rich, mineral rich, and this is another region that has had separatist movements in the past, and so the Chinese government has rolled it out there too. So these surveillance systems, they are strongest in minority regions, particularly in the western, kind of northwest and western sphere of China. But when it comes to the general population, they're still being deployed. It's just that they're not as harsh. Like people in Beijing and Shanghai, for the most part, are not being sent to concentration camps, labor camps, and so forth. Shanghai has been on a major lockdown. It's been in the news. Everyone's been ordered to stay home. And it's like COVID's finished, and it's been this massive this incredible lockdown where like no one can go out at all, and there are drones surveilling people, making sure that they're staying at home. But I would say that level of repression is the closest that major Chinese cities have come to what's happening in Xinjiang, which is far more extreme.
Thank you so much for that. Stephen Orlow asks, is there any organized resistance among the Uyghurs, internal or external, to the Chinese oppression?
I have found no evidence that there is an organized internal resistance among the Uyghurs. Anything, if that ever did exist, it was not very well organized, and it was easily crushed by the Chinese state. I mean, you just have to imagine what Xinjiang is like today. It's like if you arrive there, and most foreigners can't go there right now post-pandemic. It is just when I was there, it was an absolute science fiction novel. It was George Orwell in the flesh, and it was like Tom Cruise in Minority Report. I don't know if you've seen that movie. It's about a police force that attempts to predict murders in the future, and then they arrest people based on those predictions. It's called the pre-crime unit. This is literally what was happening in Xinjiang. They were arresting people for pre-crimes, like you're going to be a terrorist in 3 weeks. That's what the computer system says. So you have to come with us, sir. In that kind of setting, it's extremely unlikely that any kind of organized resistance can flourish. I have heard rumors here and there, but through the Uyghur community, I've heard rumors, but nothing that would substantiate it. I mean, at all. Um, there is some organized resistance outside of Xinjiang. There are various peaceful groups. So Human Rights Project. These are groups that are involved in documenting the human rights abuses. There has been talk of perhaps setting up a Uyghur in exile government that would, in theory, lead East Turkestan if it were ever to become an independent state. But other than that, there isn't really a formalized resistance group that really stands a chance of changing the situation right now.
Thank you. So, an anonymous attendee asks, China's response to your allegations would be that, unlike other groups, Islam's history clearly demonstrates a supremacist ideology. Uh, Therefore, when the Chinese say they have a genuine, realistic fear of Islam, is that true, especially with them funding other Middle Eastern countries? And can you comment on this?
Yeah, so that has been China's response to various reports put forward by United Nations bodies, by the United States, and various other governments, the UK. This is a common line that the Chinese government takes. So yes, I mean it is true that there was a fundamentalist Islamic threat in China that was tied with separatist nationalism. It was a mixture of the East Turkestan movement to create an independent nation with a group of extremist Muslims who wanted to make that happen. They wanted to create a Central Asian caliphate, essentially. Um, but that threat, it, you know, it for the amount of repression that the government there has unleashed against the minority, it is completely um, disproportionate to the actual threat. Um, so the numbers that I had when I was gathering data on the Syrian fighters, for example, the best number that I could locate was there were about 161 Uyghur fighters in Syria. And my estimate now is that about one quarter of them have died on the battlefield. That is not a threat. That does not justify putting 1.8 million people in concentration camps, the biggest internment since World War II of an ethnic minority. Like to take China's line on this and to argue in defense of China, it would require some very serious intellectual gymnastics that would be akin to defending, fascistic Chinese authoritarianism. I mean, if you can make a defense, and I know it's controversial often to invoke Hitler or Stalin, these horrible leaders, but to defend Xi Jinping and to defend his policies today would come very close to, trying to set up a defense of Hitler and what he did in the 20th century.
Absolutely. Rick Kaminer asks, sorry if I butchered that. It appears that China does not care what the world's opinion is. Can any country influence China to curtail these genocide practices? And if so, what is the approximate response to China?
So China does not care what the world thinks about the treatment of the Uyghurs. I think they've shown that they're gonna continue doing what they do because it's very deeply set in their policy, and it's also it's set within the Communist Party's historical view of where it stands in the world. I mean, if you're in China and you're a top Communist Party leader, this kind of thing makes logical sense to you if you're absorbing Chinese media all the time and you live within this blanket of censorship and you don't quite see what's going on in Xinjiang. Um, so the so the thing about the Chinese response, so Chinese officials and Chinese state media, they get extremely angry and defensive, and they have these public flip outs whenever there are stronger sanctions applied to top officials and state-owned entities. So we have seen that China does suffer economically under sanctions because a lot of the groups that have been involved in repressing the Uyghurs and just repressing democracy, liberalism in general, have been sanctioned by various governments, US, UK, EU, so forth. And the Chinese government does, the public record shows that they do deeply care about that because these companies are deeply tied to supply chains with the outside world. They're deeply tied into the supply chains for key technological sectors such as semiconductors, displays, smartphones, also garments, and so forth. And when they are sanctioned, the Chinese government does hurt, and actual officials in the party do suffer. They do become poorer as a result of these kinds of actions.
All right, well, thank you so much. Before we go, can you please let our viewers know where to find some more of your work and to where to buy these books of yours?
Certainly. So you can go to my website, geoffreycain.net. My name is spelled GeoffreyCain.net. I'm also on Twitter. It's my name, Geoffrey_Cain. And my books are they're on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. If you want, you can also check out my recent interview with President Zelensky of Ukraine. It's in Wired magazine. Just go to Google and type my name and Zelensky, and it'll pop right up. It was just published last week.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Mr. Cain, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
And for our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an update with Ashley Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.